En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 27 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Bogotá el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Buenas tardes para todos y todas. Bienvenidos. Soy Jessica Arrieta.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Arrieta, Project Coordinator for Fundación Gabo. This is the first conversation of the cycle Unexplored Territories in Migration, Borders, Mobility, and Integration within the framework of our alliance with IMO. During this conversation, we will have Luz Meli Reyes from Venezuela, Ligia Bolivar, also from Venezuela, Jennifer Avila from Honduras, and Alejandra Gutierrez from Guatemala. This activity will foster a conversation between our guests, and then we'll take questions from our audience. Today is the last day to apply for the workshop called Journalism in Motion. It's from Monday 7th to Friday, and you can visit our website for more details. Let's start with our welcoming message from Tatiana Jacon, Communications Officer of IMO. Go ahead, Tatiana. Hello, Jessica, and everyone joining us. It's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of IMO, specifically from our program, which coordinates a series of efforts and actors at different levels to encourage regular migration. And at the same time, we coordinate with different actors at different levels, where journalists, the media, and professionals in different areas of communication play a key role in order to address this migration phenomena and to describe the realities and the phenomenon affecting migration in the region. Therefore, we welcome you and we thank you for being present. There's a series of conversations that will be held, as well as a workshop and a series of initiatives providing spaces for dialogue and capacity construction, where IMO works in North Central America and the Caribbean. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Tatiana. Remember, we have simultaneous interpretation in the bottom of your screen. You can find the options. Welcome, Luz Meli Reyes, our moderator, and our panelists who have kindly accepted our invitation. Thank you, Jessica. Welcome. There's a lot of participants. I'm Luz Meli Reyes. I'm a professor at the foundation. I'm also part of Efecto Cocuyo, a digital journalistic initiative from Venezuela. I wish to thank the foundation as well as the IMO. I also want to greet everyone who has joined us in this conversation. I can say it's over 90 people who have joined us. And we also want to say hi to everyone joining us in our media, social media. We have simultaneous interpretation. And without further ado, I want to welcome our panelists. We have Ligia Bolivar. She's from Venezuela, especially a researcher specialized in human rights and associate researcher of Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, addressing the rights of migrants and refugees, and she's the president of Alerta Venezuela. We have Jennifer Avila from Honduras, director of Contracorriente Media Outlet. She has been recognized with the Excellence Award of the Gabo Foundation in 2023. We have Alejandra Gutierrez Valdizan from Guatemala, director and co-founder of the Ocote Agency, winner of the Gabo Award in the coverage category in 2022. Welcome, panelists, and let's kick off our conversation. In this conversation, we will be talking about the experience of our guests, and of course, we will open the floor for the questions that our attendees may have. My opening question: how can we perform journalistic coverage on migratory issues, detaching from misinformation, xenophobia, and stigmatization? I would like to start with Ligia Bolivar. She has been a professor for many journalists. She has a background in different disciplines, and she has taught us a lot about how to address migration with a human rights perspective. Ligia. Thank you, Luzmeli. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the foundation for opening this space. The first thing, it's quite simple and maybe self-explanatory, but I always want to say this. We need to step into the torn shoes of a migrant. Coverage needs to take into account that empathetic vision, especially in the case of the Venezuelan population, when it's already above 3, 4, 5 million. In fact, we're closing 7 million. And these numbers will somehow dilute the human drama of each one of these persons. So we need to step in those torn shoes and see what's behind each one of these persons. And of course, we also need to emphasize a little bit more about the context. We must insist on why are people leaving their country? What pushes them away? Sometimes we might think that is just for pleasure, but it's not what we see in Central America or in the Caribbean. People don't risk their lives just for fun. They do it because they face a larger risk, a larger threat in their own country. So just as an opener, I would give you those two alerts. Thank you, Ligia. Yeah, so trying to put ourselves in the torn shoes of a migrant, that's a very uh, harsh reality. Alejandra, could you tell us about your experience regarding coverage? And I don't know if it has a human rights perspective or whatever perspective you have developed. Thank you, Luzmeli, and thanks to the foundation for inviting me. It's very complex, and surely we will delve into it shortly. But for me, it's covering something that it's liquid or something fluid. it's not just a group of people or a community or something that remains somewhere. And these people, this group of people will be the same in a month because we're going to have more people coming in. It's like a phenomenon that dilutes. And how can you manage to tell that story since it's constantly moving? In Guatemala, we have different types of migration, and each one has their own specific traits. And sometimes we find it overwhelming due to their complexities. First of all, Guatemala is a migration bridge. We are the path for migrants coming from Central America and even from Venezuelan migrants, for Venezuelan migrants. We have become a mandatory path. We also have internal migration, which is also a serious issue. We usually have migration from rural areas to urban areas due to droughts, hunger, poverty, and Guatemala as a country is a migrant producer. So we have those three roads, the bridge, the internal migration, and the expulsion. Thousands of people, only in this year, 31,000 Guatemalans have been uh, returned to our country. And these figures, as Ligia was saying, are so big that it's really hard to have a head count because we don't actually realize the dimensions of this phenomenon. We also need to bear in mind that in addition to the human side, in the case of Okoto, we also see gender issues. We need to take an intersectional perspective. Migration for women is not the same as for men. We have such a tragic issue, which is sexual violence against women who are mm, moving or who are trying to migrate. So covering migration is something that seems way too broad, but we need to address it because it's transforming, continuously transforming our societies. Thank you, Alejandra. Welcome to everyone who's just joining us from Brazil, Guatemala, and other countries. Jennifer, based on what Ligia and Alejandra have said, and considering our opening question, what's your experience in Honduras and the Contracorriente experience in covering this movement that is liquid, as Alejandra was saying, it's fluid. So because so it's not the same thing when it starts and then when it finishes or during. Central America has become uh, a region, a passage region. What's your experience in Honduras and in Contracorriente? Thank you. There's a few things here. Since the beginning, we have decided to address this from the multi-cause perspective and understanding the different stages. So we have a series of things that we need to be very clear about. First of all, knowing about the stages, the exit, the passage, and the arrival. So first of all, we need to understand why are people leaving. There's a decision made. Uh, is it a free decision, or are people being expelled or exiled, or people fleeing from a threat? There are many ways and causes for a person to leave the country. We need to start working based on data. International media come to our country and say, all right, everyone leaving Honduras are leaving because of the gangs. Or they say the gangs are the main cause for leaving, or it's the one that they want or they choose to cover. But we have 70% poverty. We have a lot of people who are already living in the US, so reuniting is also a reason for a person to leave the country. And there's also structural violence, not only from maras and gangs. And then we need to understand how women and indigenous peoples and women and children and men live these phenomena in their own way. So first, we need to understand a lot of data, understand that there's a lot of causes here, and each person undergoes different experiences, and that ultimately we need to have a lot of data. And surely, in regards to how to follow all of these stages, for example, if we're covering expulsion, we need to understand the data that I was telling you about poverty, how many people are already living abroad. Is there a direct expulsion? What's the protection that the government has provided? Why are people leaving after being threatened? Are they not being protected? Why do people or do women leave because of gender violence? Are they not being protected against that? So people make a decision, such a hard decision, which is leaving. There was this trend some years ago to go beside the tracks and cover and take footage of people riding on the trains. I think we have learned a lot since then. Routes have changed, but also those routes are controlled by organized crime. And those routes include countries with migratory laws, migration laws, and they have a lot of racism and xenophobia. Some of them even issued or dictated from the US. And sometimes we don't understand a lot of that context in our path. And then we have the arrival. It's important to understand that our coverage does not end after covering expulsion or the path. We need to go all the way to the last step. What happened when they got to their destination, their country of destination? Sometimes it's just the first step of another, a harder path. What are they living in the country? What happens? What happens to the people over here living of remittances? And what happens when that people return? This involves organized crime, migration laws, uh, violations of human rights, and that also involves the countries of destination. Honduras is a country that mainly expels or exports migrants. We see everyday migrants from Colombia, from Venezuela, and we are abusing and violating the human rights of the migrants that pass through our country. So there's this disconnection. There's a country that is used to expelling people, and actually we turn a blind eye or we frown upon those who are using our country as a pathway. Venezuelans and Nicaraguans are poorly treated here. It's a very interesting time to cover how our society has construed and understood this human movement phenomenon. Let me stop there. I would like to remind you that this is a conversation. So whenever any one of you feels that you can contribute or to weigh in on something that another panelist has said, you can raise your hand and we'll open the space for that. Ligia. Many of the things that you have already mentioned, you have lived it, you have seen it. You have worked with a lot of refugees, the Colombian refugees in Venezuela, and you have seen how that flow of people shifted. So let us talk about the differences between those flows, how Venezuela was a country that received migrants and now expelling migrants. What has been your experience in accompanying migrants in their transit towards the north? That's another thing in addition to the flows, the human flows that we have seen from Venezuelans and even Colombians. I think the key word, as Alejandra mentioned, is liquid, fluid. Not one day is the same as the other. It's something that is constantly moving and shifting. It's not static. And to put this into perspective, this leads us to see that Venezuela was a country that received people from each, from almost every country of Latin America and the Caribbean for economic and political reasons. And somehow, after 2015, that flow reversed. And this is the opposite case of Colombia. Colombia was a producer of migrants, and then it became a receiver. And Honduras is not just a country that produces migrants, but it's also a country of transit, let alone Panama. So that's the main key characteristic of flows, permanent movement, and in the Venezuelan case, we have also seen in the profiles, the types of people. At the beginning, we saw a lot of people who could afford an airfare and who had a passport, and usually they had a profession or an occupation or a title that allowed them to make a living. And they arrived to countries that did not require a visa. And has that door has started to close. There's only 3 countries left that do not require visas for Venezuelans. Passports are extremely expensive now. There was a time that there were no passports being issued. And starting on 2017, we saw a massive exodus of youth, and people were not just single. Many men arrived in Peru, but after leaving their children in Venezuela. So we have this additional drama of women and children being left behind. In 2019, the flow reverted again, and then we saw a series of women and children leaving the country in an attempt to reunite with their husbands who left 2 years before. Then, with the pandemic, we saw a lot of people returning, in fact, due to a lack of support networks for people overseas. And we are now in a stage of returns. It's permanent motion, and it's very important for coverage. The only thing that is not moving is solutions. Countries are not making the right efforts to provide long-lasting solutions. We continue to see these people being perceived as migrants. I don't know if Jennifer was the one who mentioned it or Alejandra, but people leave because of the maras or gangs or stereotypes. But the political and institutional and state reasons are not being considered as causes for these migration flows. So there's a lot to be seen, and it has a lot to do with institutional response. What are countries doing in this regard? Beyond the fanfares and all the noise that they are used to do whenever they come up with a new mechanism. We have an increasing amount of participants. Welcome, everyone. Remember, we have simultaneous interpreting. I'm saying this in Spanish, but could someone please type that in the chat window? And also, greetings to everyone who's joining us in our social media. We are used to seeing these rivers, these flows of migrants in motion. Alejandra and Jennifer have talked about the stages, but I would like to know about or learn about the experience in journalistic coverage of migration beyond mobility or beyond the movement. As journalists, we know that people move from one place to another. And it's like one of the must-dos of a journalist, like show up like in a parachute and drop on a key place. But how do we address the people who have not had the chance of flowing with the speed of the flow, the people who are left behind, or the people when they arrive in their country of destination? Yeah, I was about to mention that we were making similes. Uh, it looks like this idea of, for example, 2 streets from our head office, we have this huge amount of people, Venezuelans living on the streets, and it just became normalized, seeing so many migrants living on the streets. First, we need to understand the stigma. We start to demonize and criminalize these people that for any reason have lagged or have stayed here. We did a podcast and we went outside. We went to this street 2 blocks away from here.
Que creo que también es uno de los asuntos
and ultimately, we won't get tired of saying that the government is not doing their best to protect the human rights. Miss Alejandra just froze.
Estamos teniendo problemas técnicos con la conexión de Alejandra.
Sí.
Si quieres, Luzmeli, retomamos con otra panelista y cuando
Sí, gracias. No sé, algo pasó con Ale, entonces, mientras Ale se reintegra, que tenía un punto muy, muy importante, Jennifer, si quieres agárralo en ese
So
punto.
Alejandra was saying something very important, but Jennifer, do you want to continue with the same idea? Something in your experience can be compared or similar? Yeah, Honduras has become a passage for thousands of Venezuelans, and in some occasions, this is their second time. They don't come directly from Venezuela. They come from Peru, from Colombia, from Ecuador. During a few months, we saw this, and we are still seeing a lot of Venezuelans who stayed here in Honduras. We somehow saw a response of the government to avoid this to be seen. Their approach was, let's catch them at the border and put them in the other border, in the opposing border. Migrant transportation is something that has been placed on the spotlight because there has been a lot of irregular things involving the police and the authorities in this effort of keeping it from being seen. There's this rhetoric that Venezuela was is a prosperous and a developed country. That's also part of the rhetoric or the discourse of our government. Unfortunately, we have seen that we have mafias charging migrants, charging Venezuelan, Cuban, Nicaraguan migrants, depending on how they look like or how much money they have on them, and they charge them for transportation. That's something that we have learned to cover recently. And there's still a lot to be learned, specifically in this part of transportation from one border to the other. There's a lot of claims and denounces being made. I also want to add that a few weeks ago, something happened. An American media outlet published something, the sort of, it was a group of youth who were fentanyl dealers in San Francisco. Most of the fentanyl dealers are from Honduras. So the media started to say nationwide that this community who live on, on remittances actually survive because of the fentanyl crisis. As many people started saying that this was the fault, this epidemic was the fault of these people. National media grabbed that story and included additional bits of information that unrelated, of course, and the impact that this has and the weight or the relevance that they gave to the amount of Hondurans and thus involving the people who are receiving the remittances from those people who live here. So we need to analyze that. How do we sometimes fail to understand what happens when migrants arrive in their destinations? What are their jobs and what are they doing there to send money to their home country? And how our countries become transformed as a result of those remittances. In Guatemala, and Central America, we have this architecture of remittances. These are houses that are built with remittances, but also with ideas, uh, with an imagination of how American houses are. And this has affected the aesthetics. So people receive remittances, and there's specific places where people build those houses. We have rural communities, poor, impoverished communities, and you can see a very poor house, and right next to it, a very big house, almost that could be portrayed in a magazine. And if you fail to understand and delve into how remittances have an effect on community, it's quite easy to think that, hey, something's amiss here. Why is these people being able to build such a nice house in such a poor community? So I'm not saying this should not be covered, but there's an interesting phenomenon being dealers. Of course, we need to address that. But the way you will understand the situation of the country and the community receiving those remittances and how they transform the lives of people, in addition to the lack of opportunities for migrants in the United States. It's very important. All of this is very important in order to avoid stigmatizing a whole country. And this is so serious. I mean, this is among the such a serious crisis, and Hondurans are not guilty of the fentanyl crisis. There's a lot of additional causes for this crisis in the US, which might be connected, but we need to address them the right way. So these are a series of lessons that we need to learn in regards to all of the sites
Muchísimas
that
gracias, Jenny, porque
this
también
migration
está
phenomena
dando
has.
pie para otros temas. La
Thank you.
conversación aquí es en el panel,
The
pero
topic
si ustedes vieran cómo está
is being
el chat
addressed
de
in the
la
panel,
gente
but
conversando,
you should
los
see
asistentes que
how
están
our
en esta
chat
transmisión
is
conversando,
getting filled with so
interesantísimo
many
e
remarks.
increíble.
This is
Quiero
so interesting.
pasar a hacer las preguntas que están haciendo algunos de los asistentes
Before I
y hago
ask
esta última
some of the
pregunta,
questions of our
Jessica, que
attendees,
ya
I would like
venga,
to ask
porque
this closing guiding
Jenny
question.
más o menos dio pie con esto y es, se cubre muchas veces el país que
In
se
many
va,
occasions, we cover the country
¿cómo
that you're leaving
se
from,
puede cubrir el país que se queda? Es decir, las transformaciones
or the country
que
that
se
leaves.
viven
How do you
en los
cover the
países
country that stays?
cuando salen una gran cantidad de personas,
We have
cuando envían
a
remesas,
large
cuando
amount of people
empiezan, por
leaving
ejemplo,
and they start sending
el
remittances,
dinero a
and we
entrar
have these flows of
en la
money
región.
back coming
Me
back into
gustaría,
our region.
Ligia, y si ya llegó
How do we
Alejandra por
cover that,
aquí, y Jenny,
Ligia? And if
a responder
Alejandra
también
is
a las
back with
preguntas de
us,
los usuarios.
I would like you to address this
Yo
question,
sí
and
le paso a
then
Alejandra primero para que termine
I would like
dialogar
to
para
give the
que
floor to
podamos hacer la
Alejandra
conversación.
to close
Ah, ya
her
llegó.
prior idea.
Aquí estoy. O sea, me fui unos
Perfecto, Ale.
segundos, perdón.
Disculpa que
Sí, no, hablaba, es que no sé en dónde me quedé, pero así muy breve y gracias, Ligia, pero del tema de lo,
Thank you, Ligia.
justamente
I just do want
de los
to
migrantes
close very shortly.
de Venezuela que están aquí en la ciudad.
I was talking about these Venezuelan
Y
migrants,
básicamente, nuevamente señalar cómo el Estado no se hace cargo.
and I would just like to point out that how the government is not taking care of them. We need to point this out.
Se convierten en una de las principales fuentes, si no la más importante, además de las mismas personas migrantes, que es el de las organizaciones de las casas de migrantes que
And
lo
we
reciben.
also need to talk about the organizations of the migrant houses that receive these people, because they are replacing or doing the job of the government, what the government should be doing. For example, we have the US trying, should have the US trying to invest in Guatemala in order to stop this. But this would give rise to a 3-hour conversation. And we have another thing, the vertical border, this amount of obstacles that you need to overcome. We already mentioned them, but just bear them in mind when you are doing your coverage. Each step is a border, a hindrance, paperwork, organized crime, climate change. So let's consider this border not just as the Tijuana border, the one that we have in our minds. It's a whole route filled with obstacles to get from point A to point B. And now let me address the question that you just asked, Lumeli. In regards to telling the story of the country that stays, I think it's important in order to deconstruct those issues that give rise to migration. In Guatemala, the departments or the states that produces more migrants is the one or the area that 40 years ago sent more people during the war. 1.5 million people left those areas that were highly affected by the war and are currently, and the people who live there are the ones that are being expelled. We need to address this considering racism, stigma, lack of absence of the government, structural issues. So we need to perform that coverage. Why is this going on? And why are people continuing to migrate from these areas? We also need to consider those social changes. And even though this is a multi-cause phenomenon, then this should be a we need to have a multi-perspective approach. We need to have people from many disciplines, sociologists and other types of experts to join this conversation and become allies to tell the story about what's going on with the concepts of family, or why are men leaving their families behind, and then we have youth growing without their father figure. They are raised with their grandparents. So remittances do transform. For Guatemala, it's the first reason for this country to remain prosper or economically stable. But we also have the aesthetics of remittances. But then let's ask ourselves, what is happening, what is the remaining construction for those people who stay? I will have Ligia, then Jennifer, and then we will go to the questions from the audience. I'm going to take a different perspective, even though I agree with what Alejandra was saying. And many of the things she has said can be applicable to Venezuela. We have a lot of children, elders being left behind, in addition to this whole migration drama.
Quedan muchas expectativas por detrás, ¿no? Pero aparte de eso que es muy importante, o sea, explorar
In
más.
addition to what you have just said about exploring the country that stays behind, we should also think about a couple of things more. First of all, what draws migrants in? Stories of success are the ones that draw people in. Nobody posts a TikTok video saying, hey, I tried to migrate and I failed. So we're not paying attention to the failed stories. I would like to have the resources to do so, probably Fundación Gabo does. In the case of the Venezuelan people, and it can be applicable to everyone who takes that route, how many people get to Darien? And Panama does have the statistics. How many come in, and how many encounters do happen in the southern border of the US? I have addressed this in a very
tratando de estimar, bueno, sí, más o
makeshift
menos un
way
pico de
with
120.000
estimation.
pasaron por allí.
Maybe we had a
Vamos
peak
a
of
empezar a ver
120,000.
cuántos
Let's
están
give it a
llegando.
few months
No llegan
in
a
order
los
to
220.000.
try to
O
see
sea,
if we
hay una
can see those
cantidad enorme de gente
120,000
atrapada en
up
Guatemala, en
north.
Honduras, en
No,
México,
we see
que
a
son
lot of people
secuestrados, que son
getting
asesinados.
caught
O
up
sea,
or
les pasa
trapped
de todo, ¿no?
in Honduras,
Entonces,
Nicaragua, and
esa es una realidad
Salvador,
a la que no se le está
who
prestando
decide to stay
suficiente
or
atención
who get
porque es
killed
realmente en tránsito
or
obligado,
disappeared.
¿no? Y es este que Alejandra nos decía que está durmiendo en la plaza ahí en zona 1 en
And
Guatemala.
these are the ones that Alejandra told
Que
us
no
about,
llegan, que no llegan
who are
nunca.
sleeping
Y se los van a mandar
in
a la
Zone
frontera
1
igual ni nada por el estilo.
at the square in
Y otro
Guatemala.
problema también
The
es
other
que
issue,
otro tipo de invisibilidad es, por
there's
ejemplo, la de los
another
niños
type
y
of
adolescentes no
invisibility,
acompañados. ¿Qué está pasando
is
allí?
unaccompanied
Ellos,
children and
bajo
adolescents.
toda, o sea, su tarea principal es no dejarse ver.
Their key
Porque saben que en el
job
momento que los
is
vean, los agarran y los echan para atrás. O los
not
institucionalizan y se
being
llevan al
caught.
traje.
Because if
Entonces,
they're caught, they're
no
seen, they will
solamente son
just be returned
manipulables
to the
en
country.
cualquier frontera, no puede haber registro de ellos.
They
Fuera de
cannot
cuando
be,
se
there's
les
a
consigue algún
sub-register.
auxilio en algún sitio, en un albergue, una cosa, ¿no?
The only ones that are registered is because they
En
become
realidad
desperate
es
and
muy
seek for
invisible.
asylum or for assistance.
Estoy en este momento en conversación justo antes de esta reunión de hoy
Right
con
before this
periodistas para ver de
meeting,
qué sitio sacan los
I
americanos,
spoke with a
porque
couple of
les sale más barato el
journalists.
trabajo.
I won't disclose their location,
Estamos aquí y no
but
hay
they told me,
otros
hey,
inmigrantes,
we're
¿no?
here and
Vienen
we're
escondidos,
seeing no
pero
migrants.
vienen
They're
escondidos porque
hiding.
allá es una red de tráfico tan brava
They have been hiding
que no los
because
dejan salir a la calle, ¿no? Y
the
estos dos
trafficking
periodistas que
network
hacen
is
esta
so
migración de
big
trabajo
that they cannot
están abiertos en un
go
sitio
out.
y no consiguen migrantes porque las
They
mismas
cannot
redes
find any migrants because the networks, the criminal
escogidos
networks, have
para
gathered
incorporarse.
them
Entonces el drama,
and
o
put
sea,
them into
es
hiding.
subregistro
So
en muchísimas áreas.
under registration
Gracias,
is
Jennifer.
quite significant. Sub-registration is quite
Para cerrar
significant.
esta parte y dar paso a las preguntas,
Thank you.
me encantan lo de las
And
alianzas, todo esto.
I love this that people are talking about alliances.
Ya Ligia puso lo que llamamos en Venezuela el veneno del indio. Ahí les
Ligia
dejo
has
eso. A ver,
already
ustedes por
said
profesión y
launched
periodistas
this
y médicos,
idea
a ver
about,
si
I don't know,
hacen alguna alianza.
how, what if you can make certain alliances?
Dejó a
Just she's
Jennifer.
threw
Yo
that
creo
on the
que
table.
mejor vamos a las preguntas porque yo ya había abordado un poco esta
I
parte.
think I already addressed this issue, so let's take
Perfecto.
some
Entonces
questions.
vamos a las preguntas. Hay personas
All right then.
que tienen preguntas directas para algunos.
We have people
Voy
asking
anticipando
questions
la
directly.
pregunta.
Julia
¿Qué
Durango
tanto se
is saying,
conoce o se ha cubierto
how
noticias
much
sobre
do
los
we know
flujos
or how
migrantes
much
por
have we
cambio
covered
climático? Eso lo
the issue of
mencionó
migrants due
Alejandra.
to
Julia,
climate
también lo
change?
tenemos en la
Alejandra
conversación y tú también.
spoke a
Pero
little bit about that,
te la hacemos a ti directamente y si alguien
but
tiene alguna experiencia con esto también pudiera
if
responder.
any one of you has a
Sí,
specific
yo en
answer to
temas
this,
de cambio climático, bueno, nuestros países, en el caso de Honduras, es un país súper vulnerable.
our
Entonces,
country is extremely
tuvimos una
vulnerable
caravana
regarding climate
migrante
change.
después de unas
So we
tormentas
saw
de las
a
tormentas
lot of
Iota que tuvimos
migrants
en el año
after the
2020.
Iota
Ahora estamos con
storms.
el tema de la sequía y
Now we're
que
talking about the
estamos
drought,
transitando cada año, ¿verdad? O
and each
inundaciones o
year,
sequía, que luego
either
viene
we
una
have a
lluvia.
drought or
Entonces
a
somos un país
rainy season,
altamente, bueno, y luego está la parte de la erosión costera también, ¿no?
and we have
Hay
also
desplazamiento,
coastal
hay
erosion.
movimiento interno,
So
desplazamiento
our country has a
forzado
lot
por
of
diferentes
forced
razones,
internal
relacionadas con el
displacement,
cambio climático, pero
and not only for
definitivamente
climate,
como uno
because of
de los
climate change,
factores
but climate
importantes el
change is
desplazamiento
one
forzado.
of the
Entonces,
key
lo que vemos
uh,
también es
motives
muchos
or reasons
migrantes
for
que luego
internal
salen
migration. So we see
ya
a lot of
hicieron como un
migrants
desplazamiento interno primero,
who
¿no?
have already
Son estas
undergone
comunidades que
internal
donde la
displacement.
erosión costera ya se comió
So a
su
community
comunidad, que de hecho nosotros hicimos unas historias así
where
súper
the
preciosas
coastal
con erosión
erosion
costera,
has
donde
eaten
varias
up their
de las
territory,
familias habían sido de las familias
and
víctimas
we
de la
have seen
separación
a lot of
forzada en Estados
families
Unidos
that
que
have
venían de
already
esas
been victims
comunidades
of
que
forced
habían estado
displacement, and
hechas
they
en el
came
primer
from
desplazamiento de
that
la historia de
first
ellos.
type of displacement because of
Y
this
luego
coastal
después
erosion.
de este desplazamiento van a las ciudades o van a otros
So they're
lugares y ahí
displaced
siguen
from the
teniendo
area, they move
problemas
to the
de
cities where they
sobrevivencia,
find different
pobreza,
problems,
desempleo, enfermedad
violence,
curaria
poverty,
y luego entonces la única opción que
precariousness,
tienen como
unemployment,
ocupar el
and their
lugar
only
y
alternative, or the
salir.
one that they
Pero
think they
sí
have,
es
is
algo
leaving the country
constante, o
towards
sea,
the
aquí
US.
habíamos puesto antes ese
probably we hadn't
acostumbrados
paid so
a
much attention or
climáticos que
named
traen
it.
siempre desastres y tragedias.
We were used to think that
Es una de las
natural
causas,
disasters and phenomena
¿no? Tal vez la gente no lo
do
pone
happen,
así, ¿no?
but
En esas palabras, porque como
people
les digo,
don't put it
mucha gente
in the
se
words
movió
that we have
porque
done.
la ciudad fue víctima de otras violencias o de otras
A lot
cosas
of
y luego
people moved
dio el
because of
salto
climate
hacia
change,
una
and then they
situación
became
de
victims of other types of
extrema
violence, and then they
violencia.
became external migrants.
Pero creo yo que ahora podemos, justamente como estamos contando la multicausalidad, esta es una de las causas fundamentales en nuestro
And since we talk about multi-causes, well, this is one of
Quería
them.
agregar solo allí para la persona que preguntó que la
Yeah,
Organización
for the person who
Internacional para
asked,
las Migraciones
the International
tiene
Migrations Organization
especialistas en todo el tema
has
de
specialists
migración o movilidad por cambio climático y
in
ambiental y por situaciones
climate change and
climatológicas.
environmental
Creo que
migration.
también tienen bastante material
I
informativo
think they have a
desde
lot
la
of
OIM.
information that they
Si
can
te
share or
puedo
you can look
hablar
up.
por acá sobre esto,
Alejandra, do you have anything to share?
otra pregunta,
All right, then
que es,
let's take another
creo que
question.
hay que hacerla, la hicieron en general y me gustaría que la,
It was a
abordara
general
Ligia,
question, an open question,
ella
but I
sabe
would
mucho
like
muchísimo
Ligia to address this.
un poco al uso de los términos adecuados. Oscar pregunta, los
Oscar is
panelistas
asking,
se han referido a los migrantes como
panelists have
migrantes, es
talked
decir,
or
no los
referred to
utilizan
migrants
como
as migrants.
sinónimo de
They haven't
migrantes,
used any
en el que se los
trendy
considera personas
euphemism
en situación de
where
movilidad.
they have
¿Qué piensas de
been
esto de
dubbed as
perspectiva periodística?
persons in the
¿Es así
condition
una
of mobility.
diferenciación?
Is this
Me gustaría que
difference
Ligia respondiera
useful?
esta pregunta porque
I'd like
sabemos que
Ligia
Ligia siempre
to answer this
ayuda
question.
mucho a todo el tema de conceptualización, porque a veces es
She
complicado para
can
quienes
always help us a
se
lot
acercan por
about the
primera vez a estos temas.
concepts and context.
Bueno, esto es una conversación, no una clase, así que
This is a conversation, not a lecture or a class,
queda difícil, ¿no?
but it's quite
Yo
hard.
creo que
It's a little
no todos
difficult.
son migrantes, obviamente,
But
es un término que utilizamos a veces
migrants is a
por
term
economía de lenguaje,
that we
sencillamente.
use for the
Tampoco
sake
estoy
of
del todo de acuerdo con el
language
término
economy. I
a que se refiere la persona que hizo
am not
la
totally sure I
definición.
agree with the
Se refiere uso
name
por parte
used by
de una persona movida.
the person who asked,
Digamos, un término
talking
quizás un
about
poquito más
people in
ajustado
conditions of
al
mobility,
enfoque de derechos humanos, que es lo que
maybe a
es
more
personas con
human
necesidad de
rights
protección
adjusted
internacional.
is
Si son
people
personas que se
with
van moviendo
needs
porque
of
necesitan
international
protección
protection. These are
internacional
people who are
o fueron
moving and who
negadas
need international
desde el
protection
salir, ¿no?
since it had
Eso
been
es uno.
denied by
Y
the
hay
country they have left.
diferentes categorías.
And we have different categories.
Refugiados, otro
We
tipo de
have
personas que
refugees,
requieren protección pero que no tienen la categoría
other
de refugiado. En
types
fin, hay
who need
diferentes
protection but are not refugees.
enfoques, ¿no?
So
Pero
we have different
siempre
perspectives.
decimos que no son migrantes porque, por lo que decíamos al
But we
comienzo,
always say that they are not
no se
migrants
trata de personas que
because of
salieron
what
de
we
su
mentioned
país
at the
de
beginning.
manera voluntaria
These are
porque
not people
quisieron,
who left their
sino
country
que se vieron forzadas a
by
salir
their own
por
will. They were
circunstancias
forced
de diferente naturaleza que
to
varían
live,
de país a
to
país.
leave,
No es lo mismo la salida de Venezuela que la
and by
salida
different
de
circumstances,
Guatemala. Pero en
depending
todo
on the
caso,
country. It's not the same,
no
or
son
probably
migrantes
reasons are different for
por nacer.
leaving Venezuela or Haiti or Nicaragua.
Y en ese
But
sentido es que
the common thing is that they are
o sea,
not
son personas
for
con necesidad de protección
living for
internacional
pleasure.
y eso implica
They
que
are
esa
people
protección
with the
no se
need
les dio en su
of
país de origen.
international protection, and that
Si lo
protection
quieren
was not given by their country of origin.
para terminar la cosa, lo pueden escribir en cualquier buscador, en Google,
And
donde
you
sea.
can Google it.
Personas con necesidad de protección internacional y van
People
a salir una definición mucho más
in need
exacta
of international
por
protection.
parte de ACNUR.
You can find a much more
Perfecto.
accurate definition issued by
Teniendo
UNHCR.
preguntas, te doy la palabra para ir ya cerrando esta conversación.
Muchas gracias, Luzmeli, Ligia, Alejandra, Jennifer, por acompañarnos.
Thank you, Luzmeli, Ligia, Alejandra, Jennifer.
La consulta
And
de
we want to
Gretel
close
Díaz.
this round of
¿Cómo podemos
questions with
incorporar a
Gretel
la
Diaz.
narrativa
How
del
can
tema de
we
migración a esa familia que se
incorporate
queda para
the
humanizar
families, the remaining families,
y
in order to
asimismo
humanize the story
dar un poco
and
de
also
integración a la familia
provide
de las personas
more
que deciden migrar?
integration to the whole story of the people who leave?
Pues podemos empezar con Alejandra y damos la vuelta para que cada una vaya haciendo un
All right,
cierre de
Alejandra
esa pregunta y con
and
un punto que consideren que es importante que quienes estamos hoy aquí, quienes nos van a ver luego que
What's
esta conversación se difunda por otras
what's
redes,
your answer and your
queden
key takeaway
con ese mensaje
about
claro.
this whole conversation?
Muchas
Just
gracias.
so we can start to wrap
Digamos
up.
que estas historias, o sea, ¿qué es lo que la inteligencia artificial no nos va a
These
arrojar?
stories
Quiero creer,
are
es
what
con estas
artificial
historias
intelligence
hacerlas
is
humanas
not
como
going to do
pensadores
for us.
con toda la
We need to
dignidad
put
de
a
cada uno de
face
los elementos claves
to
o
these
sea,
stories, of course,
buscar esa dignidad
with all
de la
the
historia que vamos
dignity
a contar, pero
that
al
this
mismo tiempo
story
recordar que una
requires. But
anécdota,
we
una
always
historia no
need
nos cuenta toda
to
la realidad.
understand
Y
that just
entonces
an anecdote or a short
necesitamos
story does
ese
not
doble
tell
juego,
the
ese juego de
whole, show the
influencia
whole
entre
picture.
esas
So
historias
we
que
need to
estamos
really
escuchando
understand
en las
the comparison between
conversaciones,
those
que no
stories
son
that
historias
we can
originales,
relate
esas
to,
historias
perhaps even if
universales,
they're
pero
not
al mismo tiempo
our own
sí
story.
buscar a partir de los datos, a
But we
partir de
also
los
need
informes, a
to
partir de
delve
todas las
into the data
investigaciones,
and the reports and the research
datos que respalden y nos digan esta
in order
historia
to
que estamos
find some
contando se
information that
repite
can let us know whether
en
that
el
story
tiempo,
that we
¿verdad?
are
Entonces
telling
creo que
does
ese doble
repeat a
juego
lot.
es partimos de los datos para buscar una
So
historia,
let's start with the data to
contamos esta
find
historia y luego hacemos
a
las
story, or should
preguntas
we
ya
find
para
the
ir
story and look up the data?
Perfecto.
I think that's the best
Jennifer
approach.
y luego Ligia para cerrar, porque ya
Jennifer and then
el tiempo
Ligia,
nos acabó. Esto pasa volando, este tiempo.
time flies definitely.
Sí, yo creo que es importante pues hacerse muchas preguntas, ¿no? De qué es
I
lo que
think we need to ask
sucede
ourselves a lot of questions.
cuando una persona
What
se
is
va.
lost and what
Yo
is
creo
what
que
and
la
what is the
mayoría de
winning?
las
What are the
personas se
winnings
sostienen
when a
medio
person migrates?
terminan de realmente cumplir. Ahí alguien estaba preguntando sobre el sueño
Someone was
americano.
asking about the
O sea, no
American
termina
dream.
realmente de cumplirse ese sueño, ¿no?
That
O las
dream
expectativas
is
que tenían las personas.
not
Por eso
fulfilled.
muchas
Those
personas,
expectations of the
nosotros
people.
sacamos este especial que se llama
We issue
Movimiento
this
Perpetuo,
special
¿no?
report
Haciendo
called
alusión al
Perpetual
libro de
Motion
Monterroso, pero porque justamente
in
como que
reference to the
representa el
Monterroso
movimiento
book.
perpetuo, justo como lo mencionaban antes, todo este tema de las migraciones. Y había uno sobre
And it's
esa
quite
esperanza que
similar
se perdió en
about
algún momento, ¿no?
migration. And it talks
Cuando el
about
hombre
that
salió y
hope,
su
those
sueño
hopes that were
era
lost
ser
when the man
independizado.
left with a
Pero el
dream of
país
making money and returning.
no es un lugar para
But then
regresar, ¿no?
the
Y que
country is
muchos
no longer a
todavía
place you want to return
termina
to.
diciendo, viendo su casa medio construir y deciden mejor irse porque
And
los
the
niños no
family
tienen
saw their
las
house half
condiciones
built,
para hacer
and they
producir
also
esas
decide
remesas, para
to
realmente
leave
construir la casa
because
que
there is
tanto
no
querían, para
way
realmente
to
progresar, para tener una buena
put
educación.
their
Y yo creo
remittances
que
to
hay
use
muchísimas cosas que
or
cambiar en las
to provide
comunidades
yourself with an
donde esta
education.
gente se ha
There's
ido.
a lot
Entonces
of
no
stories
solo
to
es
be
qué
told in
fue
those
la primera
communities where
cosa que
people
los
have left.
impulsó, sino también
Not just about what was the
atendían
first thing
ahorita
that
de qué era lo que
forced
se
you to
podía
leave,
hacer
but
cuando
how
se
the
tomó la
idea of what you
decisión de
wanted
poder
to do or leave
regresar,
at
¿no?
that
Y
time
esa también
changed.
obviamente las comunidades en donde el crimen organizado ahora tiene
And we
control,
also
pues
need to take a
justamente
look
porque
at
las
those
personas no
communities
quieren
where
regresar.
organized crime are now in
Y
control, so
luego
people
también
are now
hay que
refusing to
ponerse a
stay
pensar
there.
qué pasa cuando se pierde una madre,
We also
un
need to take a
padre,
look at
cuando se
the
pierde un padre,
personal
que es algo
story. What
también
happens when you
complicado,
lose your mother for so many years or
además
your
cómo
father for so
realmente
many years?
impacta eso
What's
en las
the impact
familias, en los
on
jóvenes y también hay una
families,
expectativa
youth,
que tienen los
as well
jóvenes
as
de
the
vida. Entonces,
expectations, the life
muchas veces se tienen
expectations of those
que
youth?
repatriar y que solo se hace yendo también a las comunidades.
And that can only be done
No todo se puede
by
hacer a
going
distancia
into the
porque
communities. Not everything can be done from a
todavía
distance.
creemos que la inteligencia artificial nos va a hacer las notas, pero no, porque esto no hay que observarlo y hay que verlo.
We
Y
need
otra cosa
to
que yo quería
go
agregar
to
sobre
the
lo
site
que
and observe.
estamos
I wanted to add something about the
viendo
terminology.
muchos cambios de palabras, sobre todo que vienen
We're seeing a
del
lot of
gobierno de
changes in
México.
the words,
Y creo
especially
que
from
tenemos
the
algo que nos
Mexican
preocupa
government.
mucho y
I
que
think it's
tenemos
important for us to
porque
ask ourselves
ya las detenciones no
and
se llaman detenciones.
do a lot of
Ya se
research.
llaman de otra forma,
Detentions
¿no?
will no longer be
Estamos
called
pasando de una
detentions.
retórica
They are
utilizar
now disguised
diferentes
under a
palabras
different
para
rhetoric
ocupar
because we want to be more
y yo
respectful
creo
of
que
the human
hay que
rights.
ver un
But
poco
that's actually not
las
what's
intenciones
going on.
en las cuales
We
el
need to
gobierno cambia
take a look at
los
the
conceptos
intentions of a
y
government when
saber
they change
qué es lo que
a
está
concept.
y luego no
What's the
confundirnos,
underlying reason?
si eso sucede
And let's
porque
not
nos toca ver muchas cifras
get confused. We
como
have
por
to
ejemplo
take a look at a
los
lot of
migrantes y luego
figures
es como los
from
gobiernos
Mexico
quieren ser
because our
tan
migrants
inclusos y luego
pass
cuando
through
decimos
Mexico. and now we are seeing a changes of concepts and fixed so as not to be so strong or to have such a significant impact. So we need to question those types of concepts, do a lot of research, and have allies in social sciences in order to better understand them.
Ya vamos a cerrar y varias personas han hecho comentarios en el chat. Bueno, ha sido muy
A
rico
lot of people
ser
have
parte de esta
made a lot
conversación
of
que se promueve a
comments,
través de la fundación y de la OIM justamente porque
and
es un tema tan líquido y tiene tantas
this
aristas
is
que
such a
tenemos
liquid
que
issue and it has
seguir
so many sides
discutiendo,
that we
debatiendo
need
y
to
sumando
continue
experiencias y
discussing
sumando
and
experiencias.
wondering and
Yo
adding
quisiera que
or
ya
joining
procedamos
experiences.
a hacer el cierre.
So I would like
Ligia,
to close.
gustaría
Ligia,
hablara solamente para cerrar
could you please
sobre estas
make your
alianzas
closing
que se nos
remarks
habían
about
también
these
no
alliances that
solamente
Alejandra
académicas,
mentioned,
sino
not only
multidisciplinarias
journalistic alliances,
Tú decías
but
que
also multidisciplinary
trabajando
alliances?
con dos periodistas que están en una situación,
You
¿cómo
mentioned that you
combinar
were talking
ese
with a couple of
conocimiento
journalists.
que puede
How
tener
can
una
we
institución o
combine
organización
that
que
knowledge
están
coming maybe from
un circuito
organizations
más
or
abierto
outlets
con esta
working
característica de muchas
at
veces de los
a
medios que todo
slower
es
pace
urgente?
Sí.
as opposed
Bueno,
to
yo creo
these outlets
que esas
where
alianzas
everything
son
is urgent?
absolutamente necesarias,
Yeah, those alliances are
porque
totally
desde la
necessary.
academia podemos hacer muchas cosas, pero al
From the
final esos
academia, we
libros
can do a lot of things,
se quedan en un
but
estanque.
ultimately, we produce
Y
very
nadie
nice
se
books
lee.
that sit on a shelf and nobody
Y
reads.
necesitamos a los comunicadores precisamente para
We need
traducir esos
communicators
contenidos
to
y esa
translate
investigación
those contents and
en
that
mensajes
research
clave que le
into
lleguen a la
key
población y que
messages
le lleguen
that
sobre todo a quienes
reach
tienen en sus
out
manos la
to the
capacidad de
people
tomar decisiones
and
en los gobiernos,
to reach those
para
that
poder hacer
have the
incidencia.
ability
Y
of
lo
making
contrario
decisions
también es
within the
importante, es
government.
decir, el
The
periodista
opposite
tiene
is also
esa
important.
capacidad
The journalist
esa
has
acción
the
de
ability
inmediatismo,
and
si
the
se quiere,
gift
pero
or that trait of
necesita
trying
a
to
veces
see
que
everything as
alguien
immediate, an immediate need.
le dé como más
But they
solidez o
need
más fundamento a
someone
lo
to
que están
provide
planteando.
more
Entonces,
grounds and more
por eso
foundation
creo
to the work.
ese tipo de alianzas nos benefician mutuamente. Como te digo,
Those
estos
alliances
autores
are
están
mutually
conversando con estos
beneficial.
muchachos que
As
están
I just
conectados,
mentioned, I
en
just
ese
spoke
sentido que
to
podemos
these
mencionar
couple of guys at an
tuvimos una
undisclosed
larga
place,
conversación el viernes o el
and we
sábado
talked a
antes de que ellos
lot
se fueran
on Friday or Saturday
explicando
prior
cómo
to
había
leaving
sido el trabajo que nosotros habíamos hecho. Pero ahora
to
me
let them
toca es
know
la otra parte, pues,
about our work.
ver cómo ellos
Now
son
I'm on the
capaces de
other
poder
side.
hacer esta información que nadie más que ellos va a poder
How
obtener, ¿no?
will
Entonces,
they be able to
ese tipo
gather very
de
useful
alianzas
and significant
son
information because
necesarias.
no one else will be able to do
Bueno,
so?
muchísimas gracias a
So that's the
Ligia,
alliance that could be
muchísimas
useful.
gracias a Jennifer,
Thank you, Alejandra,
nuevamente
Ligia,
por esta
Jennifer.
conversación, a los que
Thank you,
están aquí
Alejandra, for
asistiendo.
this
El día de
conversation
hoy, ¿verdad?
and
Bueno, hoy es el
everyone who
final
has joined us.
el proceso de inscripción para los talleres que
Today
vamos a
is the
tener
last
en el
day to
sector
enroll
de
in the
capacitación para la
workshops
OIM,
that will be
pero
held with the foundation at
recordar
IMO.
que
I also want to let you
este
know
tema de los territorios no explorados
that this issue of
funciona.
unexplored
Hemos estado
territories and
hablando de
migration,
temas explorados, como ustedes
even
pudieron
though we
ver
have
en las notas,
addressed issues that
hay
have actually been
temas
explored,
que
but there are
necesitan
underlying
muchísima
topics that
indagación
need
y
a lot of
muchísimos
questioning, a
periodistas
lot of
para
investigation, and a
descubrir
lot of
esa historia
journalists
detrás de ese tema
to
que hoy
tell
espero que
those
les sea de utilidad. Así
stories
que
that we
los
mentioned.
invitamos a que
So
sigan
you are all welcome
profundizando en estos temas.
to continue
No sé si le
delving
doy la
into these
palabra a
issues.
Jessica para hacer el cierre de la
Jessica, you have the
conversación
floor
o
for our
hasta
closing remarks.
Muchísimas gracias, Luzme, por
Thank
participar en
you,
esta
Luzme,
actividad. Les
for
recuerdo que esta es la
participating in
primera
this
charla de un
activity.
ciclo de 3
Remember
que
that this is the
terminaría el
first
próximo
conversation
miércoles
of a
2
series of
de
3.
agosto y el miércoles
Next
8 de agosto.
Wednesday, August 2,
Continuaremos
and then
hablando
on the
sobre las
9th,
migraciones
we'll continue working
centroamericanas y
about migration in
latinoamericanas.
Central America
Muchísimas
and
gracias
migration
a
in
todos
the
por
Caribbean.
acompañarnos
Thanks everyone for
y
joining
atender
us,
cualquier consulta que tengan.
and we
Agradecemos.
will be
En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 27 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Bogotá el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.